Frostpunk 2 was developed by 11-bit studios and released on PC in September of this year, with a console release scheduled for 2025. A direct sequel to the original that is set 30 years after the events of the first game, Frostpunk 2 sees you expanding the settlement of New London from a collection of huts to a city of tens of thousands. This review is going to answer the question, is Frostpunk 2 a worthy sequel to the first game? Let's start with the graphics and technicals. I had very few bugs and glitches or crashes during my playthrough. The frame rate was pretty steady, with AMD FSR giving my PC a boost when things got pretty hectic on screen. There were drops and freezes, usually when the game auto-saved, and several times I found that I had to press a button repeatedly or come back later before they would work. Overall, however, I would say that Frostpunk 2 is in a pretty polished state. Graphically, there are major differences between Frostpunk 1 and 2. The original was very close up to the settlement, with the ability to see each individual automaton and person walking around New London. The sequel, however, has you pulling back a lot more, meaning you lose those details. Those individuals making their way through the thick snow and blistering winds, they are now faceless blobs or lines on a screen to show activity. Pulling back means you have a vast view of the outskirts of the city and the ability to seamlessly travel to the overworld and other settlements without delay. But the world is a bit blurry unless you have a machine with the graphical power to process all the details here. I found that FSR had to do a lot of the heavy lifting to keep things stable, especially when your city reaches tens of thousands of people and you fill the map up with districts and are zipping back and forth to your settlements. The art style of the original is retained in the sequel, that unique blend of steampunk and dystopian end-of-the-world images that was so memorable. This is a harsh world, and the people who inhabit it are just as rough. I want to focus on the gameplay of Frostpunk 2, since it's a departure from the original in a significant way that may be divisive for fans. Frostpunk 1 was about micromanagement, telling individual settlers which house to live in, where to work, and what to do. People were a commodity, the same as materials or coal, and the loss or gain of a single person could make or break a game. Frostpunk 2 is about macro management. The time of New London being a small settlement huddled around the reactor for warmth are gone. Instead of a few hundred people, you have tens of thousands. An individual worker is meaningless, and the loss of hundreds in an accident or through conflict is nothing more than a statistic that flashes up in the corner of the screen, but won't affect the ability of the city to survive. As I said previously, Frostpunk 2 pulls back a lot, and you can see that in how New London is situated. The original settlement that used to fill up the whole screen and was the entire focus and dedication of a playthrough is now a small part that you can't even interact with. Instead of placing individual houses or mines or hothouses for food, you're placing districts that contain dozens or sometimes hundreds of buildings. Everything is bigger in Frostpunk 2, and the way your people survive has expanded as well. Let's go through some of the resources of the game, starting with your people. As I said, in the first game, you would need a handful of people, allocated correctly, to survive. Frostpunk 2 has you directing thousands of people as a workforce. Everything you do, from clearing away frost in order to build, exploring the frozen wasteland, or extracting resources, requires manpower. Your city will grow either naturally over time or through taking in refugees, and you will always be limited in what you can do by the number of people you have to do those things. You can shuffle people around between the various settlements you create, each one with a focus on a new type of material. Some settlements have a lot of food, or oil for fuel, or cores for building advanced technology, and you will be moving people around and having goods flow in one direction or the other to satisfy the needs of your city and your settlements. Aside from manpower, you have materials and goods, which are essentials and luxury items, food and shelter. Not having any of these won't make you fail the game immediately, but they will affect the city. Not having enough shelter, for example, means people will suffer more from the cold. Not having enough goods and materials will mean a higher crime rate since more people will steal what they need. It also means that you won't be able to build since you won't have the materials to create new districts. Not having enough food means people will eventually die from hunger. There is also the disease mechanic, which returns from the original. Partially due to cold, this has been expanded to include things like the different methods you use for extracting materials, the areas you settle in, or the healthcare facilities you have available. Then there is squalor, which increases as you build houses next to extraction places. You make laws or build buildings that ruin the environment. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't once you get the hang of it. All your material needs are up on top, with arrows going right when you have a surplus and are stocking things in a stockpile, and left when you have a deficit, are either pulling from your stockpile to cover the shortfall, or you're just lacking what you need in general. At the top are indicators for things like cold, disease, and squalor, and the higher they are, the more prominent they appear. Generally, this will be your focus for the early parts of the game as you try to balance the needs of your people. Finally, there's heat. The generator is life in this world, and you start the game fueling it with coal. But the mines are drying up and you need to venture out into the cold to look for new ways to fuel it. Luckily, you find an oil tanker and you convert the generator to use that oil. Heat doesn't work in the same way as it did in the original. You no longer build out from the generator, expanding in a circle to keep everyone warm. Instead, heat is transferred to the districts below ground, so proximity to a generator doesn't really matter. You do get bonuses for building near it or putting housing districts next to each other to add to their warmth, but this bonus isn't strictly necessary. Again, this is about macro management, and by the time the game ends, you will have districts pretty far away from the tiny little generator in the middle of the city. You won't need to upgrade the generator like you did in Frostpunk 1 either. Instead, heat is calculated by demand, and as long as you have enough fuel, everyone should get enough heat to survive, provided you give them homes. There are two major gameplay mechanics in Frostpunk 2. Resources, which cover pretty much the first half of the game, and factions of your new society. There are 5 campaign chapters in Frostpunk 2, with the first half demanding your attention to resources, planning your city and expanding settlements in order to get the things you need. But the second half of the game is all about the factions of people in your city. Just like the first game, you're given a choice of what kind of playthrough you want. During the prologue, your people discover this symbol that determines if you want to follow a faith-based society or an order-based society. I won't go into them too much, but that choice affects which groups settle in your city. There are Frostlanders, who are people who generally just survived in this frozen wasteland, and the New Londoners, who are a combination of the original settlers and their descendants who have lived in the city for a long time. These are the two general groups of people, and they are sometimes at odds in their way of life. Your job is to balance the needs of these people while maintaining their trust in you by keeping everyone kind of happy. That isn't easy because these two groups are often at odds on the direction the city should go in. Trust returns from the first game, with the actions you take, the things you research, and the laws you pass affecting people's opinion of you. If you fail to maintain the people's trust, they will exile you and you lose the game. Like I said, the later half of the campaign is more focused on maintaining relations with the people, since by this point, your resources are pretty much taken care of. As you play, people in both of these groups become radicalized. The Frostlanders develop a group called the Pilgrims, who want you to adapt to the cold. Depending on if you chose an order or faith-based game, the New Londoners will also get a group. I chose the order path, so my group was the Stalwarts. The Pilgrims and the Stalwarts hate each other. This culminates in a conflict where they are opposed to each other's vision of the future for the city, and it's up to you to balance things or pick a side. Either way, a lot of people are going to die. Now, Frostpunk 2 isn't perfect when it comes to gameplay. The tutorials are pretty lacking. Even though you have access to it at any time to understand what you should do, it's going to take you a while to figure out how to survive. For a game that's only 10 hours or so long, it may take you longer if you mess up and have to try the campaign over again. There are a lot of mechanics here that are poorly explained, like factions, how to make people happy, how to expand your districts, where to place those districts, just to name a few. Frostpunk 2 is also very unforgiving, especially on the higher difficulties. There is almost no room for experimentation. It's like you have to research things in a certain order or build in a certain way, or you're going to lose your game. Worse, you may not know you messed up for hours. For example, I didn't focus on settlements early enough in the game in my first playthrough because I was busy learning how to build the city. So when I found out that I really needed oil, I didn't have enough time to get it. Or the time when factions were fighting against each other and people were dying all over the place, I found that since I didn't understand how to please these factions, or the mechanics of how it worked, their trust in me was so negative that there was no way I was going to stay in power. There's a timer in almost everything you do in Frostpunk 2. Everything has a limit, but you just don't know what those limits are, and the game makes very little effort in explaining what you should be doing or what you should be focusing on. Make a single mistake in your playthrough, and you could find that you just can't get past it. But what's so frustrating is that the game may let you play for another half an hour or an hour without you realizing that, you know what, you've already lost. This is most apparent in the early game when finding resources, and the late game with the factions. The story of Frostpunk 2 is very underwhelming, even compared to the original. It's set 30 years after Frostpunk 1, and the settlement of New London has grown from just a few hundred people into tens of thousands. The ongoing winter still doesn't have an end in sight, and the dreaded whiteouts that had you so desperate to survive in the first game still periodically drop the temperatures way down. The captain from the first game is dead, leading your character to act as steward until they are officially confirmed as the new leadership role, or the city finds someone else. Obviously, the point is to pass the required vote to be the new leader. Aside from that, there isn't much story going on here. Nothing really gets resolved, the snow doesn't suddenly melt and free the world, the old captain dies and you become the new leader. There are plenty of callbacks to the first game. You'll find familiar settlements and places from the original, but there aren't any real new revelations. Don't expect to suddenly find the cause of the cold or a way to change anything. Frostpunk 1 and 2 are both about just surviving, nothing more. And by the time the game ends, not much has changed from when it started. The city is a bit bigger, it's ruled by a new person either by votes, faith, or force, and things keep carrying on in a similar manner. It's good in a way. It means you didn't need to have played the first game to understand what's happening in the sequel, but the downside is there's not really a satisfying conclusion. For anyone who didn't play the first game and is interested in understanding what's happening here, I'll give you a brief rundown. During the Industrial Age in Britain, when the Empire was at its height of power, something happened to the world. What it was is never exactly explained, but the consequence of it is there's a winter descending on the entire world. This isn't just a short winter that's a bit chilly. This is a never-ending winter of freezing temperatures that engulfs the entire world. There's nowhere on the planet that's spared. In an effort to survive, generators were built in remote areas that run on coal and were designed to keep a small population alive. The first game had you finding and repairing one of these generators with a small group of settlers, with the player character taking on the role of the captain. As you rebuilt the generator, a great storm was found to be on the horizon, and the point was to get enough heat and resources to survive the whiteout. Frostpunk 2 takes place 30 years later, same settlement, but now it's a city. Whiteouts still happen, but you're much better able to survive them. The captain is dead, and you take the role of the steward. It's your job to shepherd the city of New London through this new period of time. That's it. Nothing really happens outside of that. There's no grand revelations or things of consequence. The game ends, and things are pretty much the same way as they were when it started, with civilization having pushed the boundaries a little bit further. Okay, let's go into the pros and cons of Frostpunk 2. For the pros, the game expands upon the gameplay of the original. Everything is bigger. The city, the needs and demands, and the scale of your decisions. It looks and runs great. I had no issues on my PC, and I'm running a 5700 XT and still had a solid 60 FPS with FSR on. It was a bit blurry in order to keep that frame rate high, but I'm sure if you have a good PC, you won't have any issues with the graphics. It was a day one release on Game Pass PC with a console release upcoming in 2025. They have also announced the development of a few DLCs. For the cons, the story hasn't been expanded from the original. The new macro management is a significant change from the original game. It almost feels like a different style of game set in the same universe. There isn't much room for experimentation in your playthroughs. A single mistake could have lasting consequences that you can't really recover from. The game is pretty short, with a playthrough of the campaign lasting about 10 hours. There also isn't a lot of replayability. Aside from the campaign, there is an endless mode that does away with the story bits, but no new scenarios. The tutorial and explanations of the game's mechanics are inadequate, and you will find yourself failing because you didn't know you could do something to fix a problem until it's way too late to make a difference. And that's it for another review. Overall, I hate to say it, but I just didn't enjoy Frostpunk 2 as much as the original. The changes to gameplay just didn't land with me, but I can completely understand why they went in this direction. It's a logical way to do a sequel. Take the first game and make it bigger and better. I'm positive that a lot of people will enjoy what Frostpunk 2 has to offer, even if I'm not one of them. So is it a worthy sequel? That's really hard to say. It's a big change from the first game, but I'm so glad they took a risk to do it, even if I didn't personally love it. I would encourage you to check it out on Game Pass, where it's available for PC right now, and I'm looking forward to its console release. If you don't have Game Pass, it's also available on Steam. I'm the Casual Console Gamer, and I'll see you all in the next review.